I want to, I guess, start by addressing the inherent paradox of wanting to write about the lecture, even though it comes with this long history, at least in connotation, of, as you say, bullying, or
exactly.
sage from the stage is what we're told in pedagogical circles. And you actually begin the book by talking about a 1934 essay by Virginia Woolf called Why, which is short for Why Lecture. And she's writing a screed kind of against this particular kind of lecture, this very dry, bombastic, violent, right, sort of knowledge imposition. And so given that your book wants to make a case for the lecture, despite that history and connotation, I would ask Woolf's question to you now: why lecture?
Right. Well, I think that there are forms that we've hardly exhausted and that could use upcycling, recycling, re-inhabiting. I did have the privilege and pleasure of experiencing some magnificently beautiful lectures in my own upbringing, of course. So this is part of the inspiration. At the same time that really early in my career, and I don't know if it was because I was a lapsed Catholic or because I was queer, but I always wanted the modes by which knowledge is being conveyed to me to misbehave more. I wanted them to misbehave. I was moved by the fact that, or alarmed by the fact that in academia in particular, we're often made to sit as though in church, in the worst sense of that phrase. And so there was ritual, but without the incense. And so wanting to preserve some sense of the power of ritual, but to bring back to it the sensory and the sensate. Again, early on in my career, as an academic who was also trained as a poet at SUNY Buffalo, I was struck by the fact that, in the 80s, it was a very, very exciting time in literary studies. Everything was being challenged. All the paradigms were shifting right and left, from deconstruction to psychoanalytic, feminist, anti-racist, queer thought, cultural studies. And I was struck at the time by the fact that, in spite of the fact that the paradigms were shifting so radically, scholarly modes did not change. And I thought, well, in terms of what I know about art and as a practitioner of poetry, this is not the case where art is concerned. When paradigms change, forms change with them. And so starting at that point, I really wanted to reinvent what I was doing at the time that was thought of as scholarship, and to bring together kind of scholarly responsibility with a poetic ethos. Now they call what I might have been doing creative nonfiction. But the point is that ever since then, I have been interested and excited by the prospect of asking this question of a lot of different forms by which knowledge is conveyed and art is manifested, from the panel presentation to the conference to the reading. I love giving readings, but I also think that readings could afford to be something different. And I think where all of these forms are concerned, it's not just about, changing for change's sake, but because we know that they keep in place particular relations of power and relationships to knowledge and language and thought and feeling. And so the lecture is just one of these forms, as this makes sense. Who knows? I would love someday to write a book in which I treat the panel and offer a genealogy of it, or maybe someone else could do that. But I would love to read a book that would really give us a history of this thing called the panel, and then sort of argue about why is it that we still submit ourselves to that form. More recently, I would say I have a different response to the question of why lecture. So this is why I would say why lecture, because I think that the lecture can afford to be re-inhabited. It does have potential. It is nonfiction's lost performative. It's always been the essay's companion form. And but I would say that now, okay, where do I find myself now if I want to say why lecture or answer the question why lecture? I would say that like a lot of people, I'm lost and exhausted right now. And that the lecture at its best allows us to become lost in someone else's lostness. And it provides something like what I experience as a bright fog. And insofar as it makes that possible for us, I hope that it allows us something like sleep, even if it's a nap. And if we're napping, can we therefore dream? This morning, Namwali, and actually it's been happening for the past week or so, I've noticed that when I wake up in the morning, my arm is like wrapped around my head. and I don't know, I don't think it's because it's turned cold in Maine. I really think it has to do with feeling that I need to protect my head. And I think it has to do with feeling that, you know, we're dealing with various forms of precarity, vulnerability, and of course, you know, the head is the place where I'm doing my thinking too, and my dreaming. So, yeah.
I love this sense that the lecture is a place that lets us rest. It would seem as though it's it would be, you know, I think again connotatively at least, or connotatively, a place where you feel like you have to pay attention and you have to take notes and so on and so forth. But I too, and then perhaps this is because we're both academics, I have a very strong Proustian affection for sort of the smell of, you know, the podium and the dust and the, you know, there's this lovely moment in John William Stoner where he talks about a reverie that he goes into when he's in a lecture as a student. And this is what prompts him to become a professor. So I do think there's oddly a coziness to a word that sounds quite harsh. You're going to be lectured. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about the ways that the lecture is in fact sort of misunderstood or misnamed. And one of those ways is as you say, it's, you know, nonfiction's lost performative, I think is such a beautiful phrase. But you also draw the lecture in relation to several different forms. And I want to talk about many of them, but I want us to start by talking about the essay, since you just mentioned it. The essay, which, you know, essay writers always, very often, at least I am always tempted to say, this is just an attempt, just an essay. I am just going to wander around and digress for a while. But it sounds to me that you see the lecture as very much having a formal relationship to the essay. So could you talk a little bit about why you think that is? Both historically, you know, you mentioned many famous essayists whose essays began as lectures, like Emerson and Toni Morrison. But I'd also love to hear you talk about this digressive analogy between the two. This sense that you're following the lostness of a person's thought, both on the page and in the lecture form.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I mean, I think as we've already mentioned, the lecture gets a bad rap because we presume it is a top-down mode. And we immediately imagine a superego, or we imagine someone, I think somewhere in the book, I talk about the homonym of Hector, you know, Hector and lecture, and don't lecture me. These are the unhappy notions that attend the word. But the lecture does have an implicit relationship historically to the essay. Many of Emerson's essays started as lectures and on the Lyceum circuit. Same thing with Thoreau. Though Virginia Woolf claims not to have enjoyed lecturing and thought that they took too much work and didn't have enough payoff, and then she didn't enjoy the performance. Thankfully for us, she did deliver a lecture upon which A Room of One's Own was based. So the lecture in this sense, as an art form, is one that is I think implicitly a quest-driven genre. And that's what aligns it with the essay. It's not about conveying information. This is a contemporary notion of what happens in classrooms. Emerson, of course, quite beautifully wrote about the lecture. May I read what he wrote in his journal of 1839, July 5th?
Yes,
Why should we, may I? Why should we write dramas and epics and sonnets and novels in 2 volumes? Why not write as variously as we dress and think? A lecture is a new literature which leaves aside all tradition, time, place, circumstance, and addresses an assembly as mere human beings, no more. It has never yet been done well. My favorite line. It is an organ of sublime power, a panharmonicum for variety of note, but only then is the orator successful when he is himself agitated and is as much a hearer of any of the assembly. In that office you may and shall please God, yet see the electricity part from the cloud and shine from one part of heaven to the other. So I love the implication in Emerson's clarion call. The 2 implications that the lecturer must succumb to the material if he's really going to succeed, or she is going to succeed as a lecturer, and that he needs to be disarmed, and that he also needn't and cannot know what form it will take at the outset. That's really crucial to me. So, and this is how I think about the essay. There's no dictation. The essay loves to be thought of as the genre that is not a genre, or that is anti-genre.
And this essay, or this, I guess, collection of essays, perhaps, itself began as a lecture.
It did,
right?
yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I was invited in 2017 to the Ohio Literary Festival at Ohio University, the Spring Literary Festival, by Eric LeMay and Dinty Moore, wonderful writers. And I was asked to give a reading and a lecture. And I thought this would be the perfect time now for me to use the opportunity to once and for all perform a lecture on the lecture. And what happened after that, I know one of the things you and I had talked about on email a little bit was the ephemeral nature of the lecture, to my mind. It's being of necessity unreproducible, like other art forms that require a live performance and audience, and that depend upon all of the things that are happening in the room, the other people working through and with their bodies, and what's going on with your body and what the locale is. But that at the same time, I say that, I sort of wished that they had recorded that lecture. So I say that, and yet I did feel like, oh, it would have been nice if they recorded that lecture. Well, they did not record that lecture. Thereafter, Philip Graham, the wonderful writer and editor at Ninth Letter, got wind of the lecture and wanted to publish it in Ninth Letter. And from there, I think Maria Tamarkin knew of it. She's a friend and writing colleague. And of course, her magnificent book, which is published in the United States by Transit Axiomatic. I think she must have talked to Adam about it, Adam Levy at Transit Books. And I think that Adam had a sense that once he read it, that what I was proposing in the piece, or performing in the piece, was interestingly in anticipation of what he had in mind for the series. So he asked if I would expand it into an essay. And many things happened to it, of course, in that translation. One of the things that Adam and I talked about as I was working on the translation of it from lecture to essay was whether the book should or could be or might want to be a book-length lecture.
Right.
Or whether it made more sense for it to be an essayistic, lecture-infused meditation, and we settled on the latter. Obviously,
Yeah.
I don't think you can really carry off a 100-page lecture. Maybe it's possible. I mean, truly a performative lecture, maybe it's possible. But so different things happened then in that process. One was that it gave me the opportunity to dwell more on a really, really significant cousin to the lecture, which is the note
Yeah.
and the notebook. And the other thing that it made possible for me, beyond, of course, the obvious thing that I think happens when you open a lecture into an essay, which is that my curation got wider, larger, more deeply considered, my curation of texts and lectures. But most importantly, and what I could not have anticipated in the translation from lecture to essay, was that I came to really articulate and understand the origins in my own life for the interest in the essay. And it didn't have to do with having heard great lectures. It had to do with violence, actually. It had to do with having experienced in my own upbringing in Catholic school, you know, corporal punishment and the way in which pedagogy and violence are never far apart from one another. And to come to realize that my interest in the lecture has to do with wanting to create something like a peaceable kingdom in the classroom, as opposed to a peaceable community, as opposed to a place where people are getting wrapped on their heads. And I don't want to spoil the piece for people who haven't read it yet, but there was something that happens that I think when you give yourself over to essayism, and that is that I arrived at a place that had to do with the etymology of the rostrum that I really could not have known, and I hadn't been wondering about until I made the translation from lecture to essay. And I won't say more except to say that it has martial origins. And so to have discovered in a way that I only knew maybe unconsciously that my interest in the lecture really has to do with unwetting it from its violent origins.
Yeah. Well, one of the ways that you do this, I think, so beautifully, and you just mentioned, is by thinking about what is around the lecture, the para-lecture, so to speak. So specifically, I think the audience engagement with the lecture. So you would expect a lecture on lectures to focus on the lecturer, but a lot of the book is actually an incredible meditation on the note, and on the note kind of punning on the musical panharmonium of Emerson that you just referenced, the musical analogy, the note as an act of noticing or attention, which I think you spoke to in your first reading, but also just the literal act of taking notes. I was wondering if you could read, just so we can get a little bit more of the book. You have this wonderful passage on noting from page 74 or so. And there, you know, you have bullet points. This is one of the places that the book imitates some of the forms of the lecture, right? So it looks like notes, right? Because it's in these bullet, and so you can pick and choose which ones that you want to read for us. But the observations are so stunning and work, I think, best as notes, not as paragraphs or arguments. They work in this way really beautifully.
Thank you. So I'll read some of them then from that passage, that section. Okay. Imagine how this requires that we do some noting about noting, that we study our relationship to how and what we note. To do that, let's put to one side all the things we know about notes. For example, that they range in registers of mere mention to emphases, from enumerations to underscores. Then climb a winding stair of counterintuitions like that notes are the minima that constitute a life. That in the notebook, everything is plagiarized and nothing is. That a note will never tell us if it aims to finish a thought or begin one, only that it wishes neither to complete nor conclude. That the writer is the person on whom nothing is lost, but who also, in order to write anything, needs to act on what's important, to choose. that the note is a diminutive genre or minor literature. I mean, would anyone's claim to fame be that they were an accomplished note taker? That they'd created in the little lives we're given, not the consummate book or film or painting, but the consummate note? This is a good thing. Too much pressure would kill the note and keep it from holding thought in suspension. Plus, ask any essayist, you know, and they're always more happy to be listed as a notable essayist, and thus an essayist of interest, than be marred by the finality of a best. That, though we consider the note the most natural recording device, it's hard to know whether we note to remember or note to forget. That to transcribe is just that, to bring a message across a threshold. That noteworthy is redundant. That the problem with the books that we write is that they're written in one language and one language only, whereas our notes, in every case, represent a congregation of different types of signs and are rarely univocal. That foot, end, and liner notes each are different types of steps on an Escher-esque ladder of knowing. That in our current age, the worst form of noting is the trash genre, typically anonymous, called the comment. That there's possibly no note that doesn't position the writer as amanuensis, requiring therefore a master text out of view that the notebook serves. I found no way to get around this. So that's some of the notes on noting.
I love them, and they have this aphoristic quality, which you mention, as well as one of the companion genres to the lecture.
Yes.
But I'd love to hear you talk a little bit, if it doesn't spoil too much, how the note became so important to you in your own personal life. I would love to, if you could talk a little bit about your grandfather's note.
Sure. Well, my grandfather, who was a shoemaker from Teano, Italy, not far from Naples, was a writer, but labored under the burden of feeling that his English as his second language somehow did not make him worthy enough. But he really was a writer and really thought of himself as a writer. But there was that laboring under the sense that perhaps he could not be taken seriously as a writer by an audience. So he wrote and wrote and wrote to no one in particular, but left behind in his shoe repair shop mounds and mounds and mounds of what he actually literally called fragments. Fragments and thoughts of a figure named Lons the cobbler. He gave himself a persona for these jottings. And the thing about, my mother is a poet, and my mother was the person who knew to keep and hold close all of this writing that my grandfather left behind. And somewhat in Emily Dickinson fashion, you know, he jotted these notes onto the material of his trade a lot of the time. So it was whatever it was to hand, including the tabs he would use to mark down the part of the shoe that needed fixing, or the thing that he used to mark the shoe and give the customer the amount, you know, usually 25 cents. And then there'd be an aphorism written on one of these very little, with a hole, and the hole would be there, you know, and they really are, the way that he used the space of the page is, to me, incredibly beautiful. And there's the power and poignancy of what he was writing about, which often was the perils of poverty and the perils of xenophobia, but also drawing upon his own sense of having not finished more than the third grade in Italy. Still, he was a reader, and his own sense of what it meant to be Italian, to be a gardener, to be someone who made things, to someone who read Dante. And all of that is operating in the writing. But there's also something really interestingly visual about what my grandfather did when he uses the notebook page. His notebooks, if I want to call them that, are really both abstract paintings and collages, and at the same time that they are conveying content. And in that way, they really do I mean, they do remind me of Dickinson's fascicles, because there's some sense that you need to experience them in their tactility, and you need to, and they're visual as well. They need to be apprehended visually, and at the same time, the import of what they're saying is also important, is going on there. So, but my own, so there's the influence, I suppose, and the sense too that I can't recall where the paragraph is in the book, but there's a place where I say something like, you know, I feel a little sorry for my students who don't understand what the notebook can be for them. That it's not about writing down what I'm saying. It's not about recording information. It's your play space, and it's your nest. And when you have enough notebooks and you've created enough notes on pages and pages, it really does become like a habitat. The notebook for me is like a habitat. And again, I'm thinking about this waking up in the morning with my arm across my head and being still in Maine. And I happened to see a few days ago a squirrel whose tail was perfectly conformed to its body. You know, that squirrels, little brown squirrels can do this, where sitting on a post and the tail curves exactly to its spine. And I thought, I really wish I had one of those. I really wish I had something right now, not something that would
a fur coat,
something like that, or like a tail that like conforms to your spine and that I could nestle into. And again, in these precarious times, not to be cradled, not to be rendered complacent, but so as to be able to have a place that feels like a habitus. And so the notebook for me is that. And I'm really interested in people's notebooks, mostly when they veer from what I'm saying. So what does I say, you know, I don't want you to be listening for my lecture in terms of necessarily what I'm saying and getting it right, but could you as a student be willing to record what the lecture reminds you of? Is there a memory that's coming into your view because of what we're talking about? What it makes you want to know, how it makes you dream, what you want to doodle. That's the notebook, or at least one aspect of it.
I mean, what I love about, you know, one has to have one's own notes to give a lecture, you know, whether, I mean, there are some incredible lecturers that can, you know, lecture off the cuff. This is an incredible skill that I think many people have lost, academics especially, but you have, you know, you can have bullet points, you can have a script. I used to type out all of my lectures when I first started teaching, so nervous was I. But I didn't read them. I would type them out and then go and glance down and then speak them. But it was, I had just written them, so it was helpful. But there's, as you say, the discrepancy between the notes of the lecturer, what is actually delivered, and then the notes of the note takers in the audience is actually a beautiful kind of democracy. It's a beautiful kind of place where the note actually allows us to level that hierarchy that the lectern and the audience seated seems to impart on our minds. One of the beautiful passages that I think, again, really captures the way that you present the lecture as a dynamic and dialectical experience between audience members and the lecturer is by thinking about all of the ambient phenomenological elements that enter in, you know, the lecturer's cough, the drinking of the water, someone else coughing, someone standing up, the Q&A, and you know, you have this wonderful section of what if we had a set of a Q&A that was all about the unasked questions, the questions that the audience didn't feel comfortable, which I think is wonderful. But I would love for you to talk about the nap, since we've been going back to this resting posture, and also because to me it was such a profound truth about lectures, which is how often people fall asleep during lectures, but also even if you're not fully asleep and dreaming, there's a kind of reverie or a kind of lulling, as you put it. And I love the way that you combine that with this experience of note taking. So this is on page 94, and if you can read this, and then I think we can take questions from our very engaged audience.
Oh, sure. And I want to say, Namwali, that I've never extemporized, as you described, some people who can just go up with notes. And I wonder if that's a gendered thing, you know, maybe it would be a great thing to someday be able to do that. But I'm an inveterate note taker and an inveterate preparer also. Okay, this segment, sure. When was the last time that you allowed someone to read to you? When the last time you longed for this, to read you to sleep or to read you awake? And I just want to pause here to say that there is a difference between being put to sleep and being allowed to sleep, and the lecture allows us to sleep. The lecture hovers between the two, and its most heightened response, which is also its favorite temporality, is the nap. The lecture's most defamiliarizing power might be its invitation to us to sleep in some place other than our beds. And in this, it conjures our earliest memories of being read to, as though we cannot find that place in our adulthood beds, but must be jettisoned to a space unbecoming us, wherein some kind guide, gathered for a purpose unselfish, invites us over a threshold and bids us rest. We begin in darkness and return to darkness, and in between are granted a modicum of light, and thus the lecture shines a light into the light, or better, allows us for a spell the growth agent that only wakens in the dark. Darkness stimulates. No fog, no lecture. In attending a lecture, I am hopeful to exchange one fog for another, sometimes a brighter fog, other times one navigated with more confidence, one that distracts me from my own fog by introducing a more enticing one, a fog to layer atop my own, thence to sleep. But fog is not what we need, you say. We need water untrammeled by pollutants and air too clear as bells. My point is just that. At the lecture, I encounter a fog that makes the ship that is my body clearer in its outline than ever before. And I get there by way of the lull. There was a lull in the lecture, the ripe pause. You missed everything else, even stopped listening, but you needed the sound of the voice in order to continue to pursue the thing the lecture gave to you. The juncture in a lecture when I become fixated on my notes requires the voice of the lecturer ongoingly. In a Stephen Jay Gould Tanner lecture, I pause on the detail of how a tiny bone that is served as the gill support in fishes came in time to take up residence in the mammalian inner ear. I missed whatever the rest of the lecture was about, but I need his voice to stay here. The room, absent the voice, would be like draining the room of water and expecting you to continue to swim. Once under, it'd be like subtracting the foghorn or sonar that enables us to remain submerged. What is a nap in this context but a non-affirming nod, a type of note? I'm not listening, and I'm not listening. I'm noting.
I love that.
Thank you.
And it speaks so beautifully to what it feels like to be in a lecture where you're absorbed but not hearing everything, but hearing the one thing that is allowing you to pursue the thing. It's just an incredible description of the lived experience of being in this space.
Thank you.
I think one question that we might use as a bridge to our Q&A is whether that is possible in this Zoom virtual world. You know, I've been noticing that we've had a lot of contributions in the chat, some of which are questions, some of which are notes. And so it's a kind of beautiful simultaneity that I've been seeing these pop up. As your it's a kind of collective note taking here, because it's not just one notebook, right? It's the chat of the
I love that. I love that.
But yeah, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what your experience has been in trying to translate. You've already translated the lecture to the page. What is it like to translate it to this mode?
Yeah, well, you'll have to forgive me if I don't answer that in a direct way, but we're doing essayism and lecturing, so it'll probably be circuitous. I really feel a resistance to talking about how the digital modality called Zoom, for example, can or cannot accommodate the lecture. And the reason for this is that I wish we would ask the question in reverse, not how is the lecture to be applied in the age of Zoom, but how is Zoom to be understood in the age of lecture, to put the primacy on the lecture rather than on the mode. And I've been trying to write an essay actually about the lecture in this era, in the age of Zoom. And I noticed that, you know, you called Virginia Woolf's piece a screed, and it's just turning into a screed. And I don't want to create it. I don't want to write a screed. It's so very easy that an essay is not a screed. And it's especially a screed against learning management systems, which in themselves, just even as a category, anyone hearing it would have to think we're either in, you know, Dr. Strangelove or George Orwell, somewhere between the two. So my point of mentioning this is that I have 15 pages of screed on this question, but then I have another 15 pages, which is really more about what the current moment is tutoring me, where the lecture is concerned, and what I might bring to the classroom from that. And what the current moment is tutoring me is that I should be turning to the eldest and the youngest members of my family to know how to lecture now. And my mother, for example, every conversation with her is a lecture. She moves from between music and poetry to taking the pulse of the day to humor and trenchant observation. I have a 5-year-old niece who started to make collages out of nowhere with no seeming influence, taping and pasting together things, and they're narratives which only she can intuit. They don't look like stories to us, but to her there's a story that she's mapping, and she's taping them together and they fold out. And and then I have a nephew who having trouble reading in school, but he came here, and once the world was offered to him, he started to open and wanted to found himself discovering that if you put your finger on the rim of a glass after wetting it, a tone emerges. And well, what if we did that with 5 glasses, and how about 20? And now he's doing it and wants to call it mixed rhymes. I'm trying to say that I'm learning from the young members of my family, and from my mother, who is the youngest, oldest member of my family because she is so youthful, that I think our resources are around us, and that it has to do with trying to make from what we are given, and to allow the world to be the classroom. It might sound like a cliche. I mean, I'm sure someone has said that somewhere along the line in the history of education, the world is your classroom. But I really feel as though the learning management systems and the Zoom mode that we're all insisting on plugging ourselves into is really without world, and is without therefore making. And I frankly don't know really what happens to listening and all of that, because listening as embodiment is the key. So this is my way of answering that question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it really answers the question. I've been thinking
No,
that if my book were a letter, it would be signed Impractically Yours, because it's not a how-to, and I can't tell anyone how to lecture using Zoom. Like, that's not what you're going to get from the book, you know?
Well, what's amazing, it's amazing that, you know, I've received many different website links that purport to teach me how to lecture over Zoom, but none of them have actually been useful at all. So I don't think it is something that you learn through a how-to. I think, and I think that's part of the beauty of your argument here, is that it's not instructional in the classic sense, right? It's pedagogic. So that was in fact a translation of Mary Beth's question, which was, do you feel added pressure as a lecturer having to operate within the limitations of online platforms, or do platforms such as Zoom provoke or excite you in terms of perhaps upending traditional form? Or, and I think this is where you arrived, is it all far too soon to tell?
I think maybe too soon, but also I keep wanting to say, why don't we look in the attic and the barn for the things that, there are forms there that I think we've hardly learned the beauty and usefulness of. And that doesn't mean that they're mutually exclusive, Zoom versus the threshing machine, you know, but that, that there might be a way. I've been surprised, for example, Namwali, by the fact that we are in academia and as writers, we're surrounded by imaginative people, thinkers. And yet I really feel like, at least at my own university, that there's a frenzy and a panic, and that we've all just agreed, online teaching, Zooming, learning management system. Let's not pause to even try together to think of what else we could be doing. How about asking students to write letters to one another, and to have that experience of feltness and waiting, and not being fatigued in the way that the screen does fatigue us. So
yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I have a very special interest in different forms, and so a graduate course that I taught when I first got to Berkeley, I had students for their first assignment, and it was a course on the phenomenology of reading contemporary novels. So we were reading phenomenology and we were reading contemporary fiction, and I had one assignment that was like anything except a traditional academic essay. And I had students who submitted, you know, long GChat conversations they had with each other. I had students submit letters. I had students submit drawings. I had students submit mixtapes. And so I think there are way more forms out there than we seem to think. And that I think part of our responsibility as people who work with form is to make available to our students. So I fully agree, we need to be searching the attic and the barn. Okay, so I want to read some of these other lovely questions. You've both written beautifully about uncertainty and have in some way created your own genres that exemplify the wisdom and power of uncertainty. Thank you for this. That's really it. If there is a question, perhaps you can speak to how you have remained so close to your curiosity, even while academia and our culture more generally demands certainty and expertise.
I think you should take that up.
I think curiosity is really what saves me. I mean, honestly, it's like the reason that I wake up. It's why I strip my arm off of my head and get out of bed. I think honestly, it's a gift, and I don't know where it comes from. I don't know if it comes from my parents, or I think it must come from my parents, but I am never bored. I am just never bored. There's always something to interest me or think about, to be curious about. So I don't know if I can really say that I've maintained that practice, or if it's just something that is something I honestly can't live without. How do you feel about it? Do you feel like you cultivate your curiosity?
Well, I think I'm thankful for the question and for someone to have put together our twinned interest in uncertainty, and to have made this link, because when I was looking back over lecture today and thinking about our conversation, actually I did find myself returning to the idea of interest as being at the heart of the book. And something that compels me as a question always is, how do humans find and locate interest? Black Lives Matter. We're talking about what matters. How do we come to decide that this matters and that doesn't? And absolutely, curiosity is at the heart of this project. No question. How do I maintain my curiosity? Like you, I'm happy to say, maybe that's the other group. There's the group I've talked about earlier, of the friends of thought. Maybe there are friends of curiosity who never get bored, because they also don't experience boredom, I'm happy to say. But I think I was tutored this way, though, by my mom again, who was taught by her father to look. Oh, be looking, to look, there's something to see. And so having that gift, I suppose, of being taught from a very early age that to be in the world is to be interested. And without interest, we really aren't alive. I think, was the person asking how we cultivate that? I mean, that really is... That's a difficult question.
It's something I think about a lot with my nephews, with with young people. It's like there are stages of life where they are more or less curious about the world or about themselves or about other people, and so it's about sort of directing that spotlight, that they that focus. And I think with teaching, a lot of what we're trying to do is get students to look again, to read again, listen again, and find what it is that strikes you. What is the punctum for you in that particular work? Why does it strike you in that way, and how can you talk about it? But it is definitely I think it's the highest and also most difficult task of teaching is to cultivate curiosity in students. I'm always so grateful when it's just there.
Yeah. And I wonder if some of that cultivation could happen if students were helped to understand that their marginalia is meaningful, to not look where they're trained to look, but to look off center and to find meaning elsewhere. I was thinking at one point during the various crises of the pandemic and so many other catastrophes we're dealing with currently. At some point along the way, I had wanted to put together a book of irrelevancies, and it was motivated by feeling that I really can't stand the onslaught of being told what is relevant. And so I think that our students are dealing with that always too. It's hard to be curious when the news feed is a burden rather than an opening of some sort.
Yeah, I mean, I think relevancy can be this kind of opacity that actually prevents us from being interested. So, earlier when you were saying Black Lives Matter, like, what are we interested in? I was thinking about how there's been this strange disjunct for me between the assertion and the insistence and we now really want to say that Black Lives Matter, and the absolute lack of interest in Black lives. Like in the literature, in the movies, in the history. It's like, so there's this kind of, it's what's relevant, and so it's important, but is it interesting? What are you curious about? Okay, so I'm being very neglectful here. Okay, so some of the questions are much more focused on the question of the lecture itself. Could you say more about the extemporized lecture and gender?
The extemporized lecture and gender. Well, maybe just also the lecture and gender. I I mean, it still really is the case that it's nearly impossible to inhabit what passes for a female body and at the same time be heard, I think, as worthy of thought. I think that still doesn't happen much. I think it's very hard for people to both listen to a female body produce thought and apprehend the body as female and make that somehow coherent. So first of all, lecturing period and femininity still don't jive. But then extemporizing, of course, is to abandon oneself altogether, you know, from the yoke of the authority. And of course, that's much riskier. One of the things we had chatted a little bit about, Namwali and I, on email, was the matter of the question of the undeliverability of the lecture. And I lost my train of thought. Probably because I'm talking about abandoning myself and how that's
you're extemporizing.
I'm extemporizing.
No, but I mean, so it does make me think too about the way for the, you know, for Black subjects like Frederick Douglass, and, but also I feel this just as a person, as a professor, the lecture becomes a sort of proof that I have transcended my body somehow. And so I think there's also that it's not just that the two clash, but that the lecture ends up serving an extra function that can actually distract from what you're trying to say, which is that it is standing in as a kind of demonstration, like Phyllis Wheatley being forced to be interrogated about her poems, right? As a demonstration that I too have a brain, I too have a mind worth listening to. That double function, I think, can cause some cognitive dissonance for both the lecturer and the audience. Mary, when does a lecture become a lecture? I'm interested in the idea of the letter as an alternate, but you also described your mother's part of the conversation as a lecture. Must a lecture have an embodied audience? Can the speaker be their own audience? Could a letter be a lecture?
Wow, I think yes to all of those things, but then we get into the problem of, like, the essay that is everything and nothing. And I think that in my own relationship to the genre, move back and forth between wanting it to open to multiple possibility and be as capacious as possible, and even to render these endless analogies, which could hold. At the same time that I think it is, of course, crucial to be able to say, well, no, that's not a lecture. That's a speech. And getting back to the extemporized nature, speeches generally are not improvisational. I've rarely seen a political speech that allows for improvisation, nor is a speech, of course, usually in the service of, frankly, sadly, thoughtfulness. So more often, of course, a speech is trying either desperately to persuade or to feed into or pull back from some dogma or other. So I guess I'm saying, yes, I think it's really important to think together about the difference between the genre at the same time that I would encourage us to allow ourselves to find the lecture in the places where you don't expect it to be located. And I just remembered what it was I was going to say. And it's interesting that I forgot it, because it has to do with risk. And it has to do with what Hannah Arendt says, who when I quote her in the book, it has to do with the difference, the thing about speaking in public, delivering a lecture as a woman. Of course, it's profoundly dangerous. And especially now, what does it mean to be in public? I love the place where I live here, but there's one too many Trump sign I feel very unwelcome. And I feel afraid. And I just want to read the line from Hannah Arendt, and it's from a lecture that she delivered in the 60s called The Politics of Freedom. She says, I said, the lecture is courageous in ways that writing is not, especially if we consider the new brands of mean-spiritedness that characterize our day. Hannah Arendt addressed the matter stirringly 5 decades ago in ways that we can still apply today. Quote, without a politically guaranteed public realm, she said, freedom lacks the worldly space to make its appearance. Courage is demanded of us, even to leave the protective security of our 4 walls and enter the public realm, not because of particular dangers which may or may not lie in wait for us, but because we have arrived in a realm where the concern for life has lost its validity. And so that's Arendt. We've entered a realm where the concern for life has lost its validity. Thus, speaking in public becomes beyond precarious, very dangerous. Retreat into the page, I say, is easy compared with a member of Congress confronting her angry constituents on why she voted for impeachment, et cetera. And maybe we should replace all lectures with the articulateness, itself a form of heroism, of Fiona Hill. So I did want to just complete that thought because it was occurring to me when our friend in the audience asked that question about.
I mean, it is, again, one difference between the lecture in public and the lecture online, right, is that sense of risk. Although now there's the risk of being recorded and made to go viral if one has a slip of the tongue. Exactly. I've definitely had very, very, very interesting slips of the tongue that I'm very glad stay in the realm of anecdote instead of viral video. Speaking of, there's 3 questions that I'm going to sort of combine here.
Okay.
So one is about orality. Did you consider when writing your own orality with regards to lecturing? Put another way, did you attempt in any way to mimic your speech spoken rather than written voice, even if the end result would be a book? And I'm going to combine that with a question, given how the lecture format, speaker speaks, then fields questions, fits the model of conversation, which we often hold as an ideal, while an essay fits less precisely, there's no live component of interaction between reader and writer. Do you find that this book approaches that conversational ideal more readily than your other essayistic work? So first question is this book an oral form? And the second, is this book a conversational form like the lecture?
Thank you for that question. It's really stirring and interesting to me. Thank you so much for that thoughtfulness. I do think that this book is more companionate in the way that it's written. And so I call it a lyric manifesto in parts, only in parts. I'm not taken to manifesti. I don't usually write manifesti. And that brings us back to the screed.
Yes, there's also a question. There's also a question about whether your book is a polemic, so we can throw that into the book.
Okay. Okay. I'll do polemic first. My book is not a polemic. When I say it's okay, thank you. When I say it's a manifesto, I mean that I'm playing with propositions, and I'm entertaining propositions, and I hope that I do that in a musical way, in a way that wants you to enter the tempo of my thought as I travel there. So is it a polemic? Was the essay that Virginia Woolf wrote, upon which I based the opening of my lecture, a screed? I looked screed up in the dictionary today because you know, I think of a screed always derogatorily. You know,
I don't.
No, you don't?
I don't.
Okay.
I think rants and screeds have their place.
Okay, I agree. I absolutely agree. But you know, it's funny. I think that I hear the word screed onomatopoetically, even though that isn't the etymology at all. It's not the etymology at all. It turns out that etymologically, a screed is a piece of flooring, a long piece of flooring. And in the 18th century, it came to refer to overly long discourses You know, so if somebody's just going on and on and on. How interesting, I thought, because when I think of screed, I think of scree, and I think of an ugly bird and that I wish would stop talking. But I think that precisely the essay argues without arguing. And Cynthia Ozick has written beautifully about this, of the way in which the essay coerces assent or is essentially seductive. And I like to think of essays as pointless. And what I mean by that is that they don't engage the index finger. It's rude to point, but they really, the great essay is a whole hand doing its work and making its way. So I don't think the book is an argument or a polemic, but it is a lyric manifesto, and it is a clarion call, I have to say. It's a bit of a clarion call. Join me, friends of thought, in reimagining these forms that we take for granted. Now, the question of orality and conversation, and whether I was translating, if I'm hearing the question correctly, something that would more closely approximate a speaking voice onto the page, and if that's what was happening. Well, you know, I think this is a very complicated question, because I think that if we take the voice seriously, as we must, then of course we come to realize that we never are working in terms of one voice. The voice that I think in, and the voice that I speak, and that voice is an amalgam, the voice I speak is an amalgam of so many ways in which I've been spoken to, and the ways I've heard what I've been told, and the way that the voices of my earliest caretakers held me. So my speaking voice is separate and yet related to my thinking voice. And out from that is this other voice, which is the voice of writing. And so now, if you want to ask me if this is written in the voice in which I speak, I can't give you a one-to-one. There's no one-to-one correspondence. Now, clearly, if I'm writing something as a lecture, yes, I'm using a different voice. Yes, it's probably going to be less ruminative and more performative. And maybe that is one of the distinctions I would draw between the lecture and the essay. Because I want to join you, and I'm embodied, and there's joking, and we don't know what's going to happen in the space, and all of the things that are going to enter there where I'm lecturing. And that really is not the way I write when I am essaying. So essaying for me is about interiority, and the lecture most definitely is not. At the same time, that, as we've discussed, it allows for the lull, the nap, the holding environment, and all of that. Yeah. So I hope this answers those multiple questions. Maybe our questioners could ask us if they feel that I've responded to these questions. And if not, too bad, because we ended with no. I'm kidding.
Well, wait, I mean, I'm gonna ask one last question,
sure.
Which is a slightly longer, but I think fits with this question of how the lecture works as an oral form, a written form, but also this question of the individual's interiority, and then the notion of a collective. So this question says, I love what you're saying about remaking forms and how creative arts like poetry have changed form with the times. It reminds me of several poets I'm involved with in collectivity, such as Ariana Reina's now named Invisible College, name always changes, where we simply, quotes, read a text, usually poetic, out loud, coming under its spell, and then writing. I came across the term lectio divinia, divine reading, which it reminds me of. Have you come across the term lectio divinia? And also, how do you create a different kind of creative writing workshop?
Oh boy, in 2 minutes? How much time?
I think we have 3 minutes, but I think the larger question that I would like to hear about is what you think about the idea of coming under a spell, the lectio divinia, divine reading, as that seems to have some relationship to the lecture form.
Yeah, I am absolutely deeply interested in the spell, and in the ways in which the things we write cast spells. But, you know, when I wrote the book that emerged from my cancer experience, I felt that I was trying to break a spell. And it was the spell of the ritual that I was being made to enter in the cancer treatment regime. So I think that, you know, sometimes we're hoping to break a spell and other times to create one. I love the questioners drawing our attention to the Lectio Divina and their practice of reading a poem together. I'd like to know more about it. And it brings me back to my mom. So my mother grew up memorizing poems. And recently, in December, she took a fall in her apartment and was really, really badly injured. And
I'm so sorry.
she's okay. And I was with her during the days and nights of really just tremendous suffering as she tried to recover. And one night, you know, nothing would bring her out of her pain. No opiates, no music, including Stanislav Richter, her favorite pianist, no meditation tapes. They were the worst. Instead, she started to recite Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which she has mostly memorized. And that's what worked. And that was collective insofar as I believe this was part of her training in school to collectively and individually learn to memorize, recite, and then be able to return to, of course, it's not only what Coleridge is saying in that poem, it was about the rhythms of the poem, I believe, that enabled my mother finally to sleep. And spells don't always lull us to sleep, of course. Spells bring us to the place of trance. Trance and enchantment have everything to do with one another. I'm very big believer in the ways in which one form of attention has to relax in order for another form of attention to emerge. And that's what's happening in the lecture. That's what we've been talking about tonight. And I think that that's what's happening when a spell is cast. It's not that, you know, yes, we disappear, there's self-forgetting, but in that self-forgetting, something else can be remembered. It's too bad we don't have time to talk about Sun Ra tonight, because you had told me about his lecture and the place that it takes him cosmologically.
And I think that, you know, the idea of self-forgetting also reminds me of Iris Murdoch's The Sovereignty of Good, which I think also was originally a series of lectures. Where she talks about seeing a kestrel, seeing a bird, and it unselfs her because she is attending to it, right? So it's quite a beautiful model of how to interact with the world.
Maybe that's how we teach creative writing. We didn't answer how do we teach the creative writing? Maybe simply by introducing that poem. Really, I mean, the practice of what she's talking about in that poem.
It's not a poem. It's an essay.
Okay.
But
it is an essay.
But it's an essay based on a lecture, right?
Okay.
So, I mean, it's amazing the way these forms work. But I will say one of the things that I find most compelling about lecturing is when I read from another person's book. Reading from your own book you've done, but you've also read quotes from other people. And it's this beautiful way where you're sort of combining the lecturing with the reading, the spell of both, and that communal reading of reading a poem out loud that Leanne brought up. I think we are out of time. There were maybe 3 more questions, but I think we should maybe end for the night. Mary, you've done an incredible job of giving us a taste of this incredible book, which I strongly recommend everyone immediately purchase and read. Perhaps read out loud to yourself, or have someone read it to you to sleep.
Oh, that's so lovely. Thank you, Namwali. It's just been really a tremendous pleasure and gift to have the opportunity to have this conversation. And thank everybody. Thank everybody.
Thank you to everyone.
Thanks for everything tonight, and thanks to everyone's interesting and immersive quotes that they put in the chat, and we really appreciate the attention and focus of the conversation from both of you.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Okay, everybody, be well, and we're looking forward to the new era of lectures where both practical and whimsical.
Okay. Okay.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Buonanotte.